They can only go at a walking pace.
Yeah.
The horses couldn't possibly go any faster.
The day they married, Britain saw a fairy tale. A young princess, a decorated naval officer, a union that looked disciplined, glamorous, and almost indestructible. But behind that picture was a contradiction the monarchy itself did not know how to solve. What happens when the husband is a prince, yet the wife becomes sovereign? What happens when the man beside the crown is expected to lead at home but disappear in public? Why did Prince Philip give up his old royal titles, his surname, and eventually his naval future, only to enter a role with no clear definition at all? Why was he the first man in the room, yet never the first figure in the frame? And why, at the coronation that sealed Elizabeth's destiny, did he kneel before her, swear loyalty to her, and still leave without the one thing the world assumed he would receive, a crown of his own? This is what makes Elizabeth and Philip such a powerful story. On paper, it was one of the strongest marriages in modern royal history. In reality, it was also a marriage built around hierarchy, sacrifice, and a silence the palace rarely explained. He was indispensable, but never equal. He was central to the monarchy, yet constitutionally undefined. And for decades, that tension sat just beneath the surface. Let's reopen the full story and see what this marriage really demanded of the man who had to walk beside the Queen, while always standing behind her. Before this story became a quiet study in sacrifice, it looked almost ideal. Elizabeth was the future of the British monarchy, disciplined, dutiful, and already shaped by the sudden upheaval of her father's accession in 1936. Philip was something very different. Brilliant, restless, athletic, intellectually sharp, and already building a serious naval career. Official royal material notes that their engagement was announced in July 1947, and the wedding followed on the 20th of November that year at Westminster Abbey. But the emotional origin of the match goes back further. The pair had first met as children in 1934, and the meeting that truly mattered came at Dartmouth in 1939, when 13-year-old Princess Elizabeth encountered 18-year-old naval cadet Philip during a royal visit to the college. That contrast was part of the appeal. She represented continuity, restraint, and inherited duty. He represented energy, movement, and modern masculinity after the war. Philip's Royal Navy record gave him real weight. Royal biographies note that he entered Dartmouth in 1939, trained as a cadet, won the King's Dirk as the best cadet of his entry, and served during the war before returning to a promising post-war career. To the public, this did not look like a decorative husband joining a palace. It looked like a forceful young officer marrying the woman who would one day sit at the centre of Britain's constitutional life. In other words, the marriage projected balance. She had legitimacy, he had drive. She had the crown in waiting, he had the steel. And yet, even before the real tension surfaced, the warning signs were already there. Philip did not enter the marriage unchanged. Before the wedding, he became a British subject, renounced his Greek and Danish titles, took the surname Mountbatten, and on the eve of the ceremony was created Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich. Those moves made the marriage possible inside the British royal system, but they also hinted at the pattern that would define the rest of his life. Adaptation would mostly come from his side. The institution was making room for him, but only on its own terms. For a few years, the arrangement still looked manageable. By the time Elizabeth acceded to the throne on the 6th of February 1952, the couple already had 2 children, Charles and Anne. But that accession changed everything. Philip ceased to be merely the husband of a future queen and became the consort of a reigning sovereign, a position with immense visibility but no real constitutional authority. The official record is striking on this point. Although he later received place and precedence beside the Queen and was created a Prince of the United Kingdom in 1957. Royal material states plainly that he had no other constitutional role. That was the fault line beneath the fairy tale. The marriage still looked polished from the outside, but inside it, one person had inherited history and the other had inherited ambiguity. The crisis did not begin with a headline. It began with subtraction. Before Elizabeth became queen, Philip still had a professional identity that existed outside the palace. He was not just a royal husband-in-waiting. He was a naval officer with rank, direction, and a future. Royal sources note that his active naval appointment effectively ended in July 1951 because Princess Elizabeth's growing royal responsibilities required a different life, and his career came to an end altogether when King George VI died in February 1952. That sequence matters. Philip did not lose one ceremonial privilege. He lost the last version of himself that had been fully his own. Then came the accession, and the imbalance became public. Elizabeth was suddenly sovereign at just 25. Philip was now husband to the reigning monarch of the United Kingdom, yet the institution had no modern, clearly empowered template for what that husband should be. Royal material is unusually blunt about this point. Although he became a privy councillor and later received the dignity of Prince of the United Kingdom, he had no constitutional role. That is the key tension in this story. He was expected to stand at the centre of the monarchy's public life, but he was given no share of the monarchy's formal power. He was essential and secondary at the same time. The coronation in June 1953 turned that tension into an unforgettable image. Philip helped shape the event itself, chairing the Coronation Commission, which meant he had a hand in preparing the ceremony that would define his wife's reign. But when the service began, the symbolism was mercilessly clear. Official royal material states that, as husband of the sovereign, he was not crowned or anointed at the coronation. Instead, he knelt before Elizabeth and swore fealty to her, becoming her liege man of life and limb. This was not just pageantry. It was the monarchy explaining, in public and in sacred ritual, exactly where he stood. He could help organize the crown's greatest spectacle, but he could not share the crown itself. And that was where the first real aftershock began. From the outside, the young royal couple still looked dazzling. The coronation tour that followed projected stamina, glamour, and unity across the Commonwealth. Philip accompanied Elizabeth on the first of what would eventually become hundreds of overseas visits. He was seen, admired, photographed, and applauded. But visibility is not the same as authority. The man walking beside the Queen was now locked into a role defined by proximity, not position. He was close to the centre of power, yet not part of its constitutional machinery. That kind of arrangement can look elegant on the balcony and feel punishing in private. By the middle of the 1950s, the palace had grasped that Philip needed more than choreography. He needed function. That is one reason the years after the coronation are so important. In 1956, he founded what became the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, a youth programme that would spread internationally and become one of the clearest expressions of his independent public purpose. This was not a minor side project. It was Philip building a domain that belonged unmistakably to him. The following year, in 1957, Elizabeth formally created him a Prince of the United Kingdom. Official sources and the London Gazette both record that change. But the timing is telling. The title came years after the accession and years after the coronation. In other words, the institution did not begin with a settled answer to Philip's place. It had to keep adjusting after the fact. Even then, the deeper issue had not disappeared. Titles could improve appearance, but not erase structure. A reigning king's wife automatically becomes queen consort in the public imagination, and the language feels familiar. A reigning queen's husband is something far more awkward in constitutional culture. British precedent offered fragments, not comfort. Royal material points out that Philip was only the fifth consort to a reigning queen in British history. That scarcity mattered. There was no settled, modern script for male consorthood at the top of the British monarchy. Philip was not simply performing a difficult role. In some ways, he was living inside an unresolved constitutional experiment. That unresolved status also surfaced in one of the most sensitive issues of all: name, dynasty, and inheritance. Philip had already given up his Greek and Danish titles and adopted the surname Mountbatten when he became a British subject before the engagement. But after Elizabeth's accession, the royal house remained Windsor, and the question of what surname their descendants would carry became politically loaded. Royal family records confirm that in 1960 it was declared that descendants of the Queen, other than those using royal styles and titles in the usual way, would bear the name Mountbatten Windsor. Later commentary has noted that this reflected Philip's surname and effectively acknowledged his stake in the family line. The compromise was real, but so was the delay. Once again, the pattern repeated itself. First, the institution constrained him, then later, it partially accommodated him. So the scandal, if we call it that, was never one explosive revelation. It was the quiet spectacle of a proud, capable man being asked to embody masculine strength while publicly accepting permanent second place. He had military credentials, formidable energy, and a reputation for directness. Yet the system required him to walk half a step behind his wife, not because the marriage lacked feeling, but because the crown demanded hierarchy more than emotional symmetry. Over time, Philip responded the only way he really could, by building influence where the Constitution gave him none. He modernized parts of royal presentation, drove a punishing workload, represented the Queen across the world, and poured his identity into patronages, technology, conservation, and youth development. None of that erased the original contradiction. It simply made it survivable. And that is why this timeline matters so much. The fracture was not that Philip and Elizabeth publicly collapsed as a couple. The fracture was that their marriage had to absorb a constitutional inequality almost no modern marriage could comfortably sustain. First, he surrendered his career. Then he lost formal standing at the moment she gained ultimate status. Then he knelt before her in the most symbolic ceremony in the kingdom. Then the palace slowly, cautiously, year by year, created compensations around the emptiness at the center of his role. The monarchy survived that strain beautifully in public, but the strain was there all the same. And in the next part, that is exactly what we need to decode. Was Philip merely supporting the Queen, or was he also fighting, in his own controlled and often abrasive way, against a role that never truly fit the man he had been? What makes this story so compelling is that the real scandal was never a single act of betrayal. It was a structural contradiction hidden inside one of the most admired marriages of the 20th century. Philip was not pushed to the margins because he had failed. He was pushed there because the monarchy had no settled way to accommodate a forceful, high-status husband beside a reigning queen. Official royal material makes that contradiction unusually clear. He had no constitutional role. He was not crowned or anointed at the coronation, and he belonged to a very small historical category, only the fifth consort to a reigning queen in British history. That means the institution itself offered prestige, visibility, and symbolism, but almost no formal blueprint for power. Psychologically, that matters far more than many royal retellings admit. Philip entered marriage not as a passive aristocrat, but as a decorated naval officer whose identity had been built around action, rank, discipline, and command. Then, within a few short years, that trajectory was interrupted. His naval career ended as Elizabeth's royal duties expanded, and then as she acceded to the throne. In practical terms, The man with a profession had to become the companion of an institution. That is not just a career change. It is an identity dislocation. It helps explain why Philip could appear impatient, abrasive, or difficult. Those traits may not simply have been personality flaws, but signs of a proud man trying to operate inside a role that denied the instincts that had once made him effective. AP's retrospective description of Philip as someone whose marriage both defined and constricted his life fits this reading closely. There is also a gendered dimension that made the strain sharper. In a conventional monarchy, the wife of a king becomes queen consort, and the symbolism feels legible to the public. But the husband of a queen presents a different problem. In British constitutional culture, king sounds higher than queen, which is one reason a male consort is not simply elevated in parallel. Official royal history underlines the consequence. Philip, unlike a queen consort, was not crowned or anointed, so the public saw a man of rank required to perform deference in the most visible way possible. That image had enormous symbolic power. In effect, Philip was being asked to embody masculine authority in private life while publicly performing permanent second place. That tension is one reason this marriage feels so modern. It exposed the collision between personal identity and institutional hierarchy long before those questions were discussed openly. The media layer made everything sharper. Because Philip's role had grandeur, but little constitutional clarity, the press had a vacuum to work with. And when the media faces it over the decades, Philip was often framed less as a constitutional figure than as a difficult presence. Blunt, controversial, occasionally tactless, impossible to ignore. That framing was useful because personality is easier to sell than structure. A newspaper can dramatize a sharp remark or a rough edge far more easily than it can explain the constitutional loneliness of a male consort. History's profile of Philip even uses the phrase controversial consort, which captures how the public story often drifted away from the deeper institutional one. In other words, the media often translated structural discomfort into personal drama. So who won the media battle? In one sense, Elizabeth did, because monarchy naturally protects the sovereign first. Her image was duty, stability, continuity. Philip's image was energy, steel, and sometimes friction. But that does not mean he lost the larger historical argument. What Philip did, very intelligently, was build legitimacy through usefulness rather than title. Royal records show that he represented the Queen widely, including across parts of the Commonwealth, and that he founded the Duke of Edinburgh's Award in 1956, a programme that went on to operate internationally and became one of the clearest independent pillars of his public life. That was not decorative work. It was Philip creating territory the Constitution had not given him. He could not become a second sovereign, so he became something else, the monarchy's engine of action, outreach, and institutional adaptation. That is why this case resonates beyond royal gossip. It follows a pattern seen far outside palaces. When one partner occupies the visible summit, the other must either shrink, rebel, or reinvent. Philip did not fully shrink, and open rebellion would have damaged the crown he had sworn to serve. So he chose reinvention. The surname compromise of Mountbatten-Windsor, the later title of Prince of the United Kingdom, and the vast network of patronages and initiatives around him all point to the same long process. The institution did not know what to do with him at first, so both man and monarchy gradually improvised a solution. The brilliance of the marriage is that the improvisation held. The tragedy is that it had to be improvised at all. So the deepest reading of Elizabeth and Philip is not that they survived despite tension. It is that they converted tension into function. She gave the monarchy permanence. He gave it stamina, movement, and a form of masculine loyalty that did not come with real constitutional authority. And perhaps that is the most revealing lesson of all. The marriage endured not because the imbalance was small, but because both of them accepted that one of the greatest royal partnerships in history would also remain, by design, unequal to the end. In the end, the most striking thing about Elizabeth and Philip is not that their marriage was perfect. It is that it lasted while carrying an imbalance that would have broken many other partnerships. They were married on the 20th of November, 1947, celebrated their platinum wedding anniversary in 2017, and remained together until Philip's death on the 9th of April, 2021, at the age of 99. Elizabeth died the following year, on the 8th of September 2022, and was later laid to rest beside him at Windsor. Measured purely by duration, it was one of the longest and most symbolically important marriages in modern royal history. But measured more honestly, it was also a marriage built on adaptation, hierarchy, and restraint. That is why Philip's story matters so much in the final reckoning. He did not become a co-ruler. He never received a constitutional office that matched his visibility, and he formally stepped back from public engagements in 2017 after decades of service. Yet, over time, he turned a role with very little formal definition into one of immense practical value. He represented the crown, supported the Queen across thousands of engagements, and built independent purpose through work such as the Duke of Edinburgh's Award. In other words, he did not solve the contradiction at the heart of his position. He outlived it, worked around it, and gave it shape. Elizabeth's legacy, of course, is easier to describe. She was the sovereign, the fixed point, the constitutional centre. But Philip's legacy is in some ways more revealing because it shows the hidden cost of stability. Monarchies often look eternal because someone, somewhere inside them, accepts limits that are never fully acknowledged in public. Philip accepted those limits more than most men of his generation probably imagined they ever would. He surrendered career, title, symmetry, and political definition, then spent the rest of his life proving that usefulness could become a form of dignity. That may be why, in retrospect, the marriage seems stronger than many of the fairy tales built around it. It was not sustained by illusion, it was sustained by discipline. And that leaves us with the real lesson of the story. Public life rewards the visible figure, but history is often shaped just as much by the person required to stand beside that figure and never quite claim equal ground. Philip was not merely the Queen's husband. He was the man who had to invent what that meant, in real time, under global scrutiny, inside one of the most tradition-bound institutions on Earth. That invention came with friction, with sacrifice, and, at times, with unmistakable personal cost. But it also helped preserve an image of continuity that defined an era. So perhaps the final question is not whether Philip was happy in the role. The final question is what the monarchy asked of him in exchange for its survival. Because behind the pageantry, the portraits, and the decades of carefully managed composure, this was still the story of a man asked to walk behind history while helping hold it upright. And that may be the quietest scandal of all.